I said leave.
Captain, my captain.
Sit down, Mr. Anderson. You hear me? Sit down. This is your final warning, Anderson. How dare you? Do you hear me?
Oh, Captain, my captain.
Mr. Overstreet, I warn you. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. All of you, I want you seated. Sit down. Leave, Mr. Keating. All of you, down. I want you seated.
Thank you, boys.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Thank you.
If power is what you seek, knowledge is what I provide.
Lorekeeper Polkelt. 4 mana, 4/5, neutral legendary battle cry. Reorder your deck from the highest cost card to the lowest cost card. So first off, neutral legendary, super excited to get to reveal my first ever neutral legendary. Shout out Blizz. This is a really cool card. Beyond that, I think it's a really strong card with some crazy implications for how this one's going to get played. So just to talk about this functionally, how this works, it's really pretty obvious, I think, based on the card text. Your highest cost things are going to move to the front of your deck. So if you have a 10 mana card, it's going to be the first thing you draw. If you have a 9 mana card, it's going to be next, 8, etc. And if you have multiple 10s, 9s, 8s, they're just going to be put in there in random orders. But you'll draw all your 10 manas first, then your 9 manas, etc. So you're putting the often biggest, most valuable, craziest threats in your deck right on top, ensuring that you can draw them sooner, and putting maybe the leftover cards, the early game cards you don't need as you move into the mid game to late game, put those at the bottom of your deck so you don't have to see them for a long time. So you're increasing the density and quality of every single draw after you play Lorekeeper Polkelt. Now, that can work in just a generalized fashion, like I'm trying to get my biggest, best cards to stay on curve nicely, or you can use that, I think, in some really specific ways that are even more powerful and extract a lot of extra potential out of Lorekeeper Polkelt. For instance, let's talk about Malagos. I think we all know the card Malagos, used in lots of combo decks. With Lorekeeper Polkelt, you can move Malagos to the top of your deck, making sure that you draw it as soon as possible, which sometimes in combo decks, it's hard to find that combo piece. Now, of course, if you're looking for some Moonfires to go with it, there's a little bit of a downside that the Moonfires move to the very bottom of your deck. So you have to be a little bit careful in how you manipulate these things. But for instance, I'm thinking about something like Quest Warlock. It can do things like guarantee a 0 mana Malagos. Well, I shouldn't say guarantee, but very often ensure that you get a 0 mana Malagos by essentially playing Lorekeeper Polkelt after the quest has been completed. You move Malagos to the top card. You hit your upgraded hero power that draws a 0 cost card thanks to the Warlock quest. And boom, 0 mana Malagos in hand. Even if you already drew Malagos, you can try to plot twist it back in. It will fail occasionally, but very, very often you're going to end up with a 0 mana Malagos on demand thanks to Lorekeeper Polkelt. Now, again, there's some risk because maybe your Soulfires, maybe your Nether Breaths are trapped in the bottom of the deck, so you have to line things up correctly. But in a deck like that can draw so quickly and it can really stay alive for a long time, it may not matter. Just ensuring that you have that 0 mana Malagos win condition at any stage of the game is important, and Polkelt can really help ensure that that happens. I think another really crazy combo for this card is with Ysera Unleashed. She shuffles 9 mana portals into your deck, which means if those are the highest cost cards in your deck, you can play Ysera Unleashed, follow it up with a Polkelt. Any card draw at all is instantly going to fill your board with dragons because they're going to be the highest cost. They're going to cast when drawn and just chain into one another until you fill your board. You might waste a spot for Polkelt, but I think if you get 6 crazy dragons all at once, that's going to be enough to win you games on occasion. And then I think you've got this absurd curve impact for Highlander decks. Think about Highlander Hunter, for instance. You play Polkelt, you're drawing the Grand Slam, then Dragon Queen Alexstrasza, perhaps a Zixor Prime, then Dino Tamer Bran or Tiamat, then Dino Tamer Bran or Tiamat, then Varanus, and essentially you're ensuring this chain of absurd threat after absurd threat that no opponent is going to be able to keep up with if you drop that many crazy plays right in a row. And although they decrease in power over time, it almost doesn't matter just because they're so heavy hitting. Now, of course, in those scenarios, you don't want to play Polkelt too soon because you're going to get cards that you can't quite play just yet. But if you drop this at the right time, you have some stuff to fill in the meantime, you're going to absolutely go crazy for 4 or 5 turns in a row, and you're going to start dominating games. And then finally, perhaps the most subtle, but maybe even the best way I think to play Polkelt could just be in an aggro deck, a deck that's really high pressure, has a lot of face-oriented cards. They tend to run out of gas in the mid-game. They're just sitting on 1 or 2 cards in hand. They're top-decking 1-drops, and things just really fall apart. But with Polkelt, if you drop him in the mid-game, suddenly your draws are going to be the best draws in your deck. You're going to start finding follow-up damage. Maybe you hit a couple fireballs off the top to ensure that you have burst damage. Maybe you play some key charge minions in there. Maybe you put big weapons like Arcanite Reapers as your biggest cards. You guarantee you're going to draw an Arcanite Reaper on the next turn. So this can essentially set you up to have those burst finishers or follow-ups that you find at specific moments so that you know you're going to be able to keep pushing forward and try to end a game while simultaneously moving your really weak 1-drops to the back of your deck. So suddenly the problem of running out of gas or drawing really poorly off the top isn't an issue if you manage to hit Polkelt, which in many games you will, and that's going to make your consistency much, much higher in those style of decks. And on top of all this, he's a 4-mana 4/5. It's like, it's not great. Of course, we don't play Yetis these days, but there's not a huge penalty to playing Polkelt. You know, I could easily imagine this being a higher cost minion or a lower statted minion, but you're going to be able to flex this into turns just fine in the mid game. Play it alongside something else is going to be totally okay. And then your draws are just going to be dreamy forever. So clearly a lot of upside in this card. I should talk about a few downsides because I think there are some limitations to Polkelt to keep it in check. Namely is, I think, a mana flexibility problem. In Hearthstone, it's often nice to have a mix of higher cost and lower cost things, so you can start to do multiple things in a turn. So play a medium-sized minion and a removal spell that reacts to your board, or a small rush minion to trade and another threat. And you want to kind of mix and match and combine things in given turns. That's going to be harder to do as the game wears on with Polkelt because you're going to be drawing such high-cost, dense minions that you may not be able to find smaller things to go with them or complement them. So you draw a Dino Tamer Bran, but everything else in your hand is like 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 mana, and you can't combine a nice, Corrosive Breath because you hid your Corrosive Breath at the bottom of your deck. Now, clearly, depending on what's in your hand, depending on what you've already drawn when you play Polkelt, that can be mitigated a little bit, so I don't think it's a huge problem, but occasionally you could imagine your hand getting a little bit too meaty and really reducing your flexibility in a given game. On top of that is that given the popularity of, really tight deck lists, we often know what our opponents are playing in their decks. Like I said, we know in the Grand Slam, Dragon Queen Alex, Zixor, we know all these things are going to be played, which means as soon as you play Polkelt, you are giving your opponent a little bit of an informational advantage that they know what you're likely to draw on the next turn. It's like, okay, this deck runs in a Grand Slam, he's going to have a Grand Slam next turn. How can I set up to minimize the risk of playing into the Grand Slam, etc. So, although I think it's better to have really good cards and play good cards than it is to know that good cards are coming, there is still some downside where your opponent can understand what you're going to have and start to play around it at least a little. So I should also note a few clarifications and specifications that Blizzard provided me for this card. I asked a few trickier questions about how this one works operationally. So first and foremost, if you shuffle cards in after playing Polkelt, your entire deck gets reshuffled. So say your opponent is a bomb warrior and they shuffle a bomb into your deck, that means all of your order is gone. So it's not like the bomb just gets tossed in a random spot and the order persists. Everything gets reshuffled. The deck itself is shuffled every time something's shuffled in. It's not a single card being added in. It's all tossed up in the air. So you could top deck the bomb, you could top deck a 1-drop, you could still top deck a 10-drop. It's completely random once again at that stage. So there are certainly ways to counter the Polkelt ordering with any sort of additional shuffle mechanic. Also noteworthy is that cards which are discounted in your deck, think about like Mana Giant or the new card Flesh Giant, those do not change cost until they hit your hand. And I wasn't sure about this, but this is straight from Blizzard. So essentially, if you play Polkelt, you will move, say, a high cost Mana Giant to the top of your deck. You will draw it, and it will be 0 mana when you draw it, assuming you've properly discounted it by that stage. So it is actually a way to cheat out some of these cost discount cards that get discounted in deck. And that's actually another pretty cool implication and possible synergy for Polkelt, just drawing a couple low-cost Mana Giants right off the top and slamming them on board pretty early in the game. Same said for Flesh Giants. Could be a cool way to use this card. So I think that wraps it up for everything I have to say about our captain here, Lorekeeper Polkelt. And it's a pretty crazy card. I think this one's going to have a big impact on the game one way or another, given how many different ways I can see this being utilized. But I'm curious what you think. What do you have to say about Lorekeeper Polkelt? Is it good? Is it bad? How are you going to play it? What decks are you going to run it in? Share those thoughts, of course, as always, in the comments below. Thanks much for joining me on this little journey through Lorekeeper Polkelt and this crazy card reveal. And until next time, game on.